All right, we're going to get started. This is going to be the final midweek that I do. Then we'll take a break for the summer, and then we'll come back in the fall, and hopefully it'll be like normal people getting together again. But going to hit 3, possibly 4, but most likely 3 more questions tonight. So I want to make sure the audio is okay. Is the audio okay? All you have to do is reply and tell me it's okay. I'll wait if the audio is okay. Well, anyway, there's like a 30-second delay, so me waiting for you to say something. But it says here on my meter that I have good audio. I just want to make sure it's clear on your side. So before I jump into this, if someone could tell me that the audio is good, Judy and Andy, Dave and Judy, Mark and Marion, Jim, Ernie, Kitty, you guys are all here. If you could tell me the audio is fine, that would be awesome. And I will press forward. Oh, thanks, Ernie. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to jump into question number 1. And again, these are like I just had a ton of old questions over the years from when we used to do Q&A services. So this one, tonight's study, I just picked a few out, and then I kind of had to go through and update them a little bit. But the first one, it's in reference to some certain disputes that the Jehovah's Witnesses make about the deity of Jesus. And it'd be good that we would be equipped with an answer about this one. So here's how it goes. Hebrews 5:5 quotes an Old Testament scripture. Today I have begotten you. And so the question is, if Christ is God and always existed, how can he be begotten? Jim, volume's a little bit low. Maybe you can turn it up on your side, but I'll do my best. Maybe I'll just speak up. So if Christ is God and always existed, how could he be begotten? Next question comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 17. When Jesus tells Mary to go tell his brothers that he is ascending to his Father and to their Father, to my God and your God, how can he have a God if he's God? So that's kind of the basis of the question. So we're going to break this down into pieces. First piece, how can he be begotten? So the basis of this question is to say that if he is begotten, then that's where he began. And if he began, how has he always existed? And I believe that we've talked about in some of these previous Q&As how there were many appearances of God in the Old Testament, angel of the Lord, the physical manifestation of God. And oftentimes, we would say that visible manifestation, that person, that's Jesus before he came, through Mary and in Bethlehem and all that. And in fact, the Jews used to have a belief that that there was called the 2 powers of God. There was the power of God on earth, power of God in heaven. So there'd be a manifestation of God in person on earth, then there'd be God who was still in heaven, and they believed this. But about 200 AD, they did away with that because it would have emboldened the Christian claim that Jesus was God. So a lot of that theology was kind of worked out of Jewish theology at that point. So, but simple answer, how can he be begotten? Simple answer, because it was prophesied that he would be begotten. Now, we got a bunch of scriptures here that he would be born in the line of Abraham, that he would be descendant of Isaac, that he would be a member of the tribe of Judah, Genesis 49, verse 10, that he be from the lineage of King David, Jeremiah 23, verse 5, that his birth would be accompanied with great suffering and sorrow, Jeremiah 31, verse 15, that he would be born of a virgin, Isaiah 7:14, that he would be born in a town called Bethlehem, Micah chapter 5, verse 2. So we have all these prophecies that the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, would be born. So when we consider his virgin birth, we affirm that he had to be miraculously begotten by God rather than by natural parents. However, the real nature of this question lies in the assumption that Jesus did not pre-exist his natural birth and his physical life on earth as a man. That's kind of the premise of the question. Oh, how could he be begotten? You are then saying that he never pre-existed that. So if we address this assumption, the nature of the question loses its validity. If you were to read down 2 more lines in Hebrews chapter 5, and this is where the Jehovah's Witnesses will oftentimes draw their argument from, but if you would have just read down 2 more lines in Hebrews 5, you'd see a classification of Jesus' life. In Hebrews 5:7, it says, in the days of his flesh. And so that is setting apart the days of his flesh from other days. There's an implication here is that there was an other classification of existence other than the days of his flesh. In fact, the book of Hebrews is all about the affirmation of Jesus' deity, his preexistence, and his eternal nature. Now, Hebrews 13:8, extremely familiar passage. Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. If we are forced to affirm the argument that Jesus isn't God based on the alternate understanding of Hebrews 5, then we have a mountain of proof that says otherwise to explain away. In John 8:52, we have to explain away his very words, what Jesus himself said. He said in John 8:52, he said, truly I say to you, before Abraham was, you know this, I am. Why is this a claim of the deity, pre-existence and oneness with God? Because this is how God identified himself to Moses. In Exodus 31, verse 14, God said to Moses, I am, this is the Popeye verse, and Paul did the Popeye verse too, but here's God, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And that's what Jesus said in John 8, before Abraham was, I am. John 1, verse 1 is a sufficient text for us. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, another manifestation from the Old Testament, oftentimes when they would say the word of the Lord came to someone, the word of the Lord came to a prophet, or the word of the Lord came to Abraham or to Joseph or whoever the word of the Lord was coming to, lots of times in that discussion, it wasn't just like words into his head or spoken words. The word of the Lord was given physical identification, like the word of the Lord stepped or the word of the Lord handed. I mean, there were things saying that the word of the Lord was actually a term which spoke of a physical man in their presence. So even the word of the Lord spoke of Jesus or God in the form of man, even in the Old Testament. However, this being a cornerstone passage for the deity of Christ, it doesn't work when arguing with Jehovah's Witnesses. You know, when we say, well, let's look at John 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, they will come back and they'll say, oh no, what that really means is that the Word was a God. There is no such article attached to the second mention of theos in that passage. There's no Greek text that has that definite article, the Word was a God. Now, there's an absolute article with the word theos, which is common in the accusative case. The Word was the God. And it goes on to say that God was the Word. And in secular use of this word, theon in the Greek, it can be translated as God or goddess. But there's nothing in this verse grammatically to indicate that such is the intent concerning Jesus. This verse, if we grammatically break it down and consider the definite articles that really be there, it does not say in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. It says the Word was God. How can he be begotten? Because it was prophesied, because it was God's plan, but he pre-existed his days in the flesh as God, and he post-existed his days in the flesh as God. Now, the second half of this question is based on John 20, verse 17, wherein Jesus says, I am ascending to my Father and your Father. I am ascending to my God and to your God. So the question is, how can he, being God, have a God? So for that matter, how can he be God and talk to God? How can he be God, yet as he was being baptized, God spoke audibly from heaven? So these are the questions that people have. This question dovetails with one of our other questions. How do you understand the triune nature of God versus the individual identities? And both of these questions can be wrapped up basically in our lack of ability to completely understand the triune nature of God. God has three individual aspects of a singular identity which are manifest and explained as individual identities. God the Father is God, God the Holy Spirit is God, God the Son is God. They are all three one God. They are all three unique and individual personalities. So that's going to wrap up that question. I'm not going to go too much into the Trinity topic. I really want to spend a little more time on these next two. And this first one, listen, I'm not 100% sold on one view over the other. I am more akin to embrace and believe in the young earth view of creation. However, as a study, I do see some merit in some representations of what some will say is older. So what I want to do is kind of take a fair look at both sides. I come down more on one side than the other, but I do see some validation in the argument. So the question is, what does the Bible tell us about how old the earth is? Should we care about how old the earth is? And how do we reconcile dinosaurs and cavemen with a young earth? That's the big question. And Jenny Coleman, you have logged in and said hello, and I say hello back to you. So personally, I don't think the Bible literally tells us how old the earth is, but the Bible does lay out a history of about 6,000 years. We can go through and kind of map out all the timelines all the way back, and we see a history of about 6,000 years. And this time frame lines up with those compiled by other people groups, other cultures, and even other religions. I mean, much of the stuff that we see in the Old Testament, you're going to see in other religions, because religions of that day were witnessing and seeing the same things that the people of Israel were witnessing and seeing, and like the giants or the Nephilim or the flood, a lot of those things kind of carry over into other traditions because they were all witnessing the same thing. So the Bible lays out a time frame. Many other groups, people groups, cultures, religions kind of have similar timelines. In fact, the Mayans date the worldwide flood at about 3,113 BC because they believed in a worldwide flood. The great majority of cultures date the known history of man between 3,000 to 6,900 years. So the great majority is kind of within that time frame. But as the beginning of the creation account states, it says this in Genesis 1, verse 1 and 2. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. So there was a time period that we will call in the beginning. And what happened in the beginning? Andy, you're here. Hi, Andy. So what happened in the beginning? The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. That's what we know. So this formless earth was there when God began his 6 days of creation. How long did it exist? That's the question. And the answer is, I have no idea whatsoever. Based on, now a lot of people say, well, what about the measurements of the expanding universe? Well, let's consider that for just a moment. Based on the measurements of the expanding universe, scientists estimate that everything began to expand from a central location 12 to 14 billion years ago. So our God is omnipotent. Our God exists outside of the bonds of time. Our God is in control and over all of these things. It's nothing for him to establish the in the beginning event at any time. Maybe he established the in the beginning event 12 to 14 billion years ago. Maybe he established the in the beginning event 6,000 years ago. As far as the earth itself is concerned, scientists currently claim, here's what they say, that it's about 4.5 billion years old. And these estimates change periodically throughout history, but that's kind of where we're at nowadays. And they base this on something called radiometric dating methods, which apparently rely on a handful of other preliminary assumptions and methods. Some folks say that these methods are rock solid. Some folks say that these methods are flawed. Now, apparently, they have used this method to date a volcanic rock, and they've come up with staggering differences of age. For instance, a rock formed in 1986 at Mount St. Helens was tested, and they came away and they said, this rock is 2.8 million years old. And somebody said, no, I actually found this rock. It was created and formed in 1986. And then a rock created by a volcano in Hawaii in 1959 has results ranging, same rock, same test, but different results. Someone would say 1.7 million years. Someone said 15.3 million years, but it's a rock that was created in 1959. Why so different? Well, the answer is based on how they answer a list of preliminary questions. And I don't understand these questions, but they have something to do with initial amounts, parent amounts, and daughter amounts. There are also apparently different forms of radiometric dating methods. The most common one is carbon-14. You've heard about carbon-14. I've heard about carbon-14. They throw carbon-14 around. Carbon-14 dating says this. So here's what carbon-14 dating means. When an organism is alive, it takes in carbon-14 and it takes in carbon-12. When it dies, the carbon intake stops. The carbon-14 is radioactive, meaning it decays into nitrogen-14. So when they date something, they determine it from the measured ratio of radioactive carbon-14 to that of normal carbon-12. So, what's the difference? Now, the problem with this is that carbon-14 has a derived half-life of 5,730 years, which means it is completely depleted, that's the word. It is completely depleted within 50,000 years. What does that mean? Well, it just means that anything beyond 50,000 years they can't date, but they're dating things in the millions and the billions of years with carbon-14. So they continue to date things by other methods as being millions of years old, and these are things that, well, they still have carbon-14 in them. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a guy who read some articles and encyclopedias and Wikipedia and things like that. I'm comfortable with a historic age of the earth as 6,000 years old. I'm not completely comfortable with the age of the earth being 6,000 years old. I just think there seems to be a lot of evidence that maybe the actual physical earth before creation existed longer than that. But I'm totally grasping there. I'm not 100% certain that the Bible is telling me that the earth is 6,000 years old. People divide over this passionately, though. And if you read through the research that the old earth creationists consult, and if you read through the research that the young earth creationists publish, both of them have their scientists, and both of them are passionate about their views, and both of them hold them up to support Scripture. You can see, if you're willing, you can see a biblically sound explanation for each of them. Genesis chapter 1 may very well be a historical account of what God did in literal 24-hour, spans. It may be literal 24-hour spans. And a lot of people say, well, it has to be because that's what it says. Well, we're very limited in translating the full meaning of the Hebrew into English, and we don't always get the full ramification of that. The word day is equally translated, or the word yom is a segment or a period of time. And I want to look up a passage, if I can find my Bible software here. So we do find the phrase, there was morning and evening. And we find that a lot, and we say, oh, look, that's 24-hour period of time. Well, it is now in our language, in our terminology. If we looked at this literature and said there was nothing poetic about it, there was nothing figurative about it, but Genesis, the creation account, was written out in poetic form. So we have a day, or yom, which just speaks of the light part, because the dark part was Layla. So we have yom, which is the day, and so this speaks of a period of time or a segment of time. And then that term, there was morning and evening. This is an ancient term, and I believe it was Chaldean, that meant the beginning and the end of a process. So that was a term. We began the process, we ended the process, and the time in between they would use this term, there was morning and there was evening. So Yom speaks a period of light, contrasted with Layla, which means night. Now, I want to look at the use of, everyone says Yom's got to be just like daytime, like normal, like, the earth rotating around the sun and the 24-hour day period. And most cases it is, but not in every case. So I want to look at a passage in Zechariah, and there's a lot of these, but we'll just look at one. Zechariah 14, verse 7. Let's make it so you guys can see it. Zechariah 14, verse 7. On that day, Yom, there will be neither sunlight nor cold frosty darkness. It will be a unique day, Yom, a day known only to the Lord, with no distinction between day and night. When evening comes, there will be light. On that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half of it east to the Dead Sea, half of it west of the Mediterranean, in summer and winter. The Lord will be king over the whole earth. On that day, Yom, there will be one Lord, and his name the only one. So is that word day referring to a 24-hour time period? No, we look at that and we say, this is going to speak of the millennial reign, the new heaven, the new earth. This speaks of a large time period. So the word Yom does not always just speak of, what we would look at on our clocks as being a time period of light. So the poetical nature of the creation account, some would say, oh, look, this lends towards a figurative story rather than a literal story. And those who see creation from this angle, they're not making an argument for evolution. No Bible-believing old earth proponent makes an argument for evolution. They actually have strong arguments against it. I haven't seen one. They're simply making an argument for a biblical model of creation that fits in with things discovered and affirmed in the scientific community. Now, I've read arguments on both sides, and I could say, oh, both sides have very convincing arguments. And both sides can interpret their situation in a way that still kind of holds the Bible up, as being true. And I don't for a second doubt the ability of an omnipotent God to create everything in 6 days. And I wouldn't for a second discount what God can do miraculously, because I'm trying to create a belief system that's more comfortable to my logic and to my world's idea of science. Both views make room for the existence of dinosaurs. Both views have explanations for the formation of fossils in the layers of the earth. And quite honestly, I don't see one view or the other as a threat against the validity of the faith. Now concerning cavemen, that's like, well, what about cavemen? That is, fossils found of humanoids who have different shapes and forms than the men of this current time. So they find a humanoid fossil and they say, oh, look, it's different than what we are now. that means, because we found a skull or a jawbone that's different than ours, that means there must have been an evolution process. And so, much of what we learn from these is an argument based on evolution. The evolutionary theory stands as something needing to be proven. So fossils are found, and they're plugged into this theory, and then they're explained accordingly. And even if you find humans in different form, it doesn't really make an argument for macroevolution. It doesn't make an argument that one species jumped to another species. It might support, microevolution or adaptation within a species, which is something that nobody really has a problem with, that there is such a thing as adaptation within a species. People have always changed over time due to their living environments. Even today, many people exist in different shapes and different colors all over the world. Dinosaurs existed, primitive human beings existed. The real argument lies in how their fossils are dated. And I'm not a scientist, but there's a lot of scientists out there who divide on this issue and who scientifically come to a conclusion on one side or the other, and they can still do it by claiming the Bible is true. So I lean heavily towards young earth. If given the choice, I will lean towards what is a more literal interpretation. But one thing I'm learning about Hebrew, and just in this past year and studying it, is that there's a lot of things in the Hebrew language that are saying a whole lot more than what the translation in English is saying to us. And so what I'm going to say now is I have a lot to learn about the things that are written in Hebrew. Now, let's hit another question. That was controversial, all right? Old earth, young earth, very controversial. People are very passionate about one side or the other. And anytime I've ever come up with a discussion, there used to be someone in the church, very old earth proponent. So whenever the discussion would come up, they would take me aside and they would say, here's why, you should see it this way. And then we have people who are strong young earth people and just big supporters and fans of answers in Genesis. So I would talk about this and they'd take me aside and say, here's why it's 100% got to be young earth. I'm not seeing 100% on either, but I do have a heavier percentage on one side. So that was controversial. So let's try to do something a little less controversial. And 7:34, let's go ahead and wrap up with this question because I don't know how long it's going to be. But this one isn't very controversial. So the question is, what does the Bible say about alcohol and the Christian's responsibility towards it? Now, there's no controversy at all in this one. Let's lay down some statistics first. Statistically, about 10% of the people in the United States who consume alcohol are considered alcoholics. So out of 100 people who consume alcohol, 10 of them are considered alcoholics. It might be more, but statistically, that's where it's at. 1 in 3 families is affected in a negative way by someone's drinking problem. Alcohol abuse causes our society a cost of $40 to $60 billion a year. Some estimate it as high as $100 billion a year. On an annual basis, deaths related to excessive drinking are close to 100,000 people. Half of all traffic fatalities and 1/3 of all traffic injuries are alcohol related. So alcohol causes a lot of damage and health issues and death and hardships and car wrecks. And, if we applied the current thinking of our government and our society, we would ban it completely, or we would make you drink alcohol with a mask on. I don't know. So that's what's going on in our world right now. The Bible has 17 warnings against the abuse of wine and strong drink. 17. Write that number down. 17 warnings against abuse of wine and strong drink. That's a big number. 17. It has 19 examples of abuse. So write that number down. 19, that's a big number. It has 3 mentions concerning church leadership that they would not be men who are addicted to drink or given to drunkenness. So for this reason, it's easy to understand why the church, and it's mostly the American church, and if you find churches in other parts of the world who have these views. It's because they're probably churches that, because of the missionary movements out of America early on in the 40s, 50s, 60s, that were influenced by this thinking. So it's easy to understand why the American church and those churches influenced or planted by the American church have a flat-out prohibitionist view concerning alcohol. But the question still stands. Does the conservative church in America have a biblical view on alcohol, or does the conservative church in America have a cultural view on alcohol? Now, I was saved in a Baptist church, and then in high school I moved to an evangelical free church, and then after some time, college and missionary work and bouncing around, I ended up in Calvary Chapel. All of these groups are known to have strong policies against any form of alcoholic consumption. But we don't form our views or our doctrines based on the culture of our denomination. We have to stop and say, okay, that's what my culture says, that's what my denomination says, but as always, what does the Bible say? So let's take a look at alcohol in the Bible. Now remember, strong drink 19 times. That's a big number. Remember the warning? Was it 13 warnings? It was somewhere around there. Remember that number? In the Bible, wine is mentioned 228 times. Now let's talk about how wine is used categorically. Hold on real quick. I want to just check in on the feed, make sure everything's going good here. So, here's the breakdown on the mentions. 228 mentions. It's just spoken of as an accepted and normal part of culture. Wine 58 times, strong drink once. Symbolic, the wine of his wrath is spoken in a symbolic way. 32 times for one time for strong drink. Wine is called a blessing from God 27 times. Wine in offerings and sacrifices 24 times. Loss of wine, an example of a curse from God, 19 times. Examples of the abuse of alcohol, 16 times for wine, 3 times for strong drink. Vows of abstinence, 15 times, 6 for strong drink. Warnings against abuse, 13 warnings against, 4 for wine, 4 against for strong drink. Gifts between people, 9 mentions of wine. Comparisons, like Christ is better than wine, there are 5 of those for wine. False accusations of drunkenness, 3 for wine, 1 for strong drink. Rules for selecting deacons, 3 for wine. Miscellaneous mentions, 3. Abstinence in deference to a weak conscience, 1. So we have 3 categories. We have negative categories. We have neutral categories, and believe it or not, we have positive categories. So let's start with the positive categories. 58 references. That's 24% of all biblical references on alcohol are casual references to wine as an integral, common, accepted part of the culture. No stigma or judgment is associated with these references. 47 mentions of wine are given as an example of God's blessing. And the lack of wine is an example of God's curse. 25 mentions are in reference to offerings and sacrifices, and 9 times it is mentioned as a gift. Now, a lot of people will say, well, the wine they drank back then was just like grape juice. And I've read articles on that, and it's not even worth talking about, because if you read those articles without an agenda, you will realize they're crazy. So 21 on a neutral level. So we have mentions on a neutral level. 32 are symbolic, 21 references to vows of either partial or total abstinence. And then on a negative level, all but one of the 40 negative references to alcohol concern the abuse of it. There are 17 warnings against abuse. There are 19 examples of abuse. There are 3 guidelines against drunkenness or addiction when selecting church leaders. And initially from Romans 14, we get a warning concerning the weaker brother. And he says, it is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. Romans 14:21. So this one requires tact and discernment. If you know that a brother or sister in the Lord believes that it is a sin to drink alcohol no matter what, or if they believe it is sin to eat meat, for some religious reason, or if they believe that it is sin to go to the movies or play cards or cut your hair or listen to rock and roll or so on and so on, we are told for their sake to not do what might cause them to stumble, because the Lord honors their conviction. Does this mean we never play cards? In the off chance that someone might see us and be tempted to gamble? No, it doesn't mean that. We've begun to play euchre at my house. That's a card game. In Leviticus 19:28, it says to not cut yourself or tattoo yourself for the dead. This passage speaks of idolatrous and religious practice. It speaks of doing something in an idolatrous religious practice to honor a dead person. It is an idol worship practice. But some people think then, because of that, they take it totally out of context and they say, oh, it's a sin to have a tattoo. So should I cover up Romans 5 that's on my arm? I wasn't receiving this tattoo as an act of pagan worship. And so you can say, well, how do I handle this? Basically, no matter what you do, someone is going to consider something a sin. So you have to figure out where to draw the line. You have to weigh the conviction of that person, and you have to ask yourself, how biblical is it? I can understand someone having a strong biblical conviction about alcohol because there are clearly several passages about abuse that are negative, and there are a lot of people have a negative experience with it, so their conviction is going to be really strong. I should honor that. I should never do anything to cause that person to stumble. But if a person looks at Leviticus and they interpret it 10 miles out of context, I'm not going to go out of my way to be careful with their convictions. So you have to figure out where to draw the line. Basically, in a negative sense, the Bible teaches us that we should avoid drunkenness, we should avoid addiction, and we should avoid the offense of others. Those are the three rules, the three probationary rules for New Testament believers. Avoid drunkenness, do not become addicted, and do not offend others with it. So we live in a country where the church is strongly influenced by prohibitionist ideology. So we've been interpreting this topic through that belief for quite some time, even to the point where we try to make a case for the wine in the Bible as being grape juice, and which makes all the warnings against drunkenness more difficult to figure out. Oh, it was just grape juice. Well, then why are all these warnings about drunkenness? Don't get drunk with wine. I was like, don't worry, I'm just drinking grape juice. That warning is in vain. Don't become addicted to wine. Oh, don't worry, I won't become addicted to wine because it's just grape juice. So it's a touchy topic for many people, and I believe we should do our best to respect each other's convictions. If you're a Christian, and if you drink alcohol, it's wrong for you to think that drunkenness is acceptable. That's biblically wrong. Drunkenness is not acceptable. If you get to the place where you're like, I feel like I need a drink, or this has been a hard day, I need a drink, or I can't go to bed unless I have a drink, I need a drink. If you get to that place, it's a dangerous line, because you're starting to step into the addiction realm. The Bible is clear that you are not to be addicted. So, 3 things to the Christian. Consider the convictions of others. Do not get drunk. Do not get addicted. Otherwise, I don't see any New Testament prohibitionist view on it whatsoever. So, if you see me in the grocery store and you have a 12-pack of beer in your cart, don't get nervous and hide and run a different direction, because I have seen some of you do that before. So you're okay. Don't get drunk. Don't get addicted. Don't cause your brother to stumble. Other than that, follow your convictions and be true to them. So that's it. 3 topics, no controversy tonight whatsoever. Just easy stuff we all can agree on, right? Right? All right. So thanks for signing in. Thanks for being here. Oh, Michael Castorani was here too. Michael and Eileen. Have a good crowd of folks here. It seems like there's a lot more people here than what we have for concurrent viewers, but I think maybe several people are viewing from one stream at a time, which, can happen. Anyway, glad to have you here. We're going to shut this puppy down, and we will catch you guys on Sunday, some of you in real life and some of you here on the live feed.